Will Scouching has given his verdict on the Winnipeg Jets prospect pool, and you might be surprised with what he's got to say. Let's chat about his rankings on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we're starting off a little bit spicy with an interesting little tidbit from Scouching. Will Scouch has a great prospect analysis system. Personally, if you've never watched his videos, I'm not sure what pre-going private is still available. But if you got the chance to watch some of his old prospect breakdowns, you know that the way that he evaluates everyone holistically, on top of deep data analysis and deep dives into how players accomplish some of these statistical outliers. Long and short of it is he's got a great process, and I think he really considers, context and why certain players are maybe struggling, why they're really excelling. It's why Lambert really ranked highly at the start of his analysis all the way through some of the years where he did struggle. And look, he'll freely admit that Lambert is not a perfect prospect, but when we actually talk about where Lambert ranks in his tiers, Brad's really, really, really high up. And actually, it's some of the other players that are perhaps a little bit lower on a scale that might surprise you. So we'll talk about some of that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, and dive into his prospect rankings and what we should take away from it, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket on YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, when you look at prospect rankings, a lot of times we tend to take this stuff with a bit of a grain of salt. Everyone has different analysis and perspectives on what makes a prospect good. But all that said, if you find yourself really sitting outside the general consensus, there is probably a chance you're just wrong, especially if you're doing it repeatedly with a lot of different prospects. With Will's analysis, I tend to find that he has some really good nuances that perhaps differ from standard rankings, just because I feel like he's a little more transparent with some of his analysis and some of what he likes stylistically. And it's why there are certain players on here that perhaps rank a little bit lower for him versus what I might be looking for in my own, judgments for what I think could be a core player for the Jets, right? So he's got like a few different tiers. The first is franchise level. Then you've got core. Then you've got I would say guys who are kind of like in the depth range. Then you've got the maybes, who are players that could become NHLers at some point. They just have some things in their game or perhaps some circumstances that hold them back. And then the everyone else tier is, more or less the guys who aren't likely to be particularly impressive or have a major impact in the organization. But that's not to say that they couldn't become something at some point. It's just right now they may not exactly project to be high-end NHLers or even everyday players. So in the core tier, we're going to skip franchise tier because we don't have anyone in that tier, but core tier right now, Alphonse Frey and Brad Lambert. Now, you might be a little surprised to see Frey, but Alphonse is one of those guys who's really dynamic offensively and has great skating, really smart attacking instincts, and has many of the sort of passing and shooting traits that Will tends to really like. He often emphasizes offensive upside and skill as a big part of his projections, and I think Fry is one of those guys who very neatly aligns to many of those core traits. Now, he, if you actually look at his breakdown of Frey's game, he does kind of put some definite, flags here and there on some of what Definitely needs work long term, but all that to say, he does feel that over the years, if he continues to do well overseas and eventually moves over to North America, the Jets could have a really fun player. Lambert is also in this tier. Brad is a guy he's long been a fan of, and it's why, one of the reasons I was so thrilled the Jets got got Lambert where they did at 30th overall. That pick I still think is going to be one of the best the Jets ever make. In terms of like a steal, that is a crazy, crazy pick. Now, you'll notice Shuberkov, Salamonson, and a few others are not in this tier. Salamonson, Yeager, and Barlow actually make the next tier of depth. And in this respect, Yeager and Barlow actually do make sense to me. I think both of these guys have like middle six potential or likelihood. Yeager might have a little bit more upside, but I think for the most part, they are going to play strong 200-foot games that maybe lack a bit of like elite offensive pop. But in terms of like their releases, definitely higher end. Whether they have, elite puck handling, one-on-one engagement, spatial awareness, all that stuff, it's a little more of a mixed bag there. Salamonson made this tier just because it actually was a very close decision. My suspicion is that Salamonson's lack of like a really high-end scoring game is partly why he's more in this tier than Core. It's not that he's not going to be like a good top 4 defender or anything. It's more like his elite offensive upside is non-existent, right? He's more of a solid two-way puck moving blue liner who may not contribute a ton offensively, but could bring a very stable, very mature game. It's why I've compared him to Dylan DeMello. So Will was kind of like on the border with this decision, but given how he tends to look at like offensive output, I get this one. Now, what did surprise me was that in the the question mark maybe tier, there's a couple of names that really stood out. The guys that I'm not surprised about: Torgerson, Milic, Walton, Kuzman, Lopone, Lucius, all of those guys I think probably make sense in this tier just because they all have some legit, I would say, translatable skills at the NHL level, but all of them need work. I think Torgerson, for me especially, was a particularly disappointing past year or so for him. I kind of hoped he would become a stronger two-way forward that would actually project into the NHL, but so far haven't really seen a lot of signs of that yet. Lucius really is just because he hasn't been able to stay healthy. If he has a healthy year, I think he moves more into the depth tier for now and could actually get himself all the way up to the core, but that requires him to stay healthy, and that is, a bit of a question mark. Shuberkov, he was relatively praiseworthy for Shuberkov, but I could imagine that maybe there's some question about his game sense and decision making, whether he back checks aggressively. I think that's kind of where some of his maybe his defensive lapses could be, a reason why he's maybe knocked down a little bit. But I think in my mind, Shuberkov is probably a solid NHLer, and I do think he will be on this team in the upcoming season. In the everyone else tier, you've got Jacob Julian, Connor Levis, Garrett Brown, Danny Zhilkin, Wagner, Bauer, DiVincentis, and Naring. I think people are probably going to be a little upset seeing Zhilkin, Wagner, and maybe Julian there. Brown is also pretty decent. DiVincentis, I think a lot of folks are going to be like, really? But, goalies are voodoo, so I don't really read too much into that. I think Julian might actually, for me, end up more in the depth tier. I think he's kind of like another Walton, although Walton maybe developing a little bit faster. Walton kind of reminds me like of stylistically a little bit like of course the one time I'm trying to think of him from the Sabres, Tage Thompson. I don't know why I was suddenly blanking there. He actually did model his game after Tage, so it does make sense that when you look at how he sort of carves through defenders, it's similar. I don't know that Julian necessarily plays the same game, but they're both big, brawny forwards, tall, relatively physical, strong, and could be perhaps the heir apparents to Adam Lowry at some point. So funny that they're kind of drafted in subsequent years, but Wagner, I think is one of those guys that Jets fans have seen some fun stuff in international tournaments and maybe dare to dream. Would be a little bit interesting to see how he actually translates to the North American game. Zhilkin, I think, actually does project to be a solid bottom six player for the Jets. I just think the first season for him at the pro level didn't really go according to plan. This year, I think, will be the chance for him to lock in and likely have a bit more of a success. regardless of like the individual tiers, I tend to agree with Will's overall thought that, the Jets have done well relative to where they've drafted, and they've assembled a pretty solid pool of talent. Winnipeg may not have like tons of franchise prospects or really elite prospects, but what they do have is a good selection and variety of tool sets and stuff that does project to be some kind of professional player. I think the biggest question for a lot of these guys is what level they eventually hit. Will they be top sixers, middle sixers, depth players, or more rotational? And I think that's where you have a lot more room for debate. But overall, I think a lot of these rankings make sense. I think you could really make an argument that this pretty much aligns to the most likely scenario for a lot of these guys. But all that said, I'm hoping for upside. I'm hoping that some of them, get promoted in this pyramid going forward. It would be cool if Lambert could eventually become a franchise level player, but that's daring to dream just more than a little bit than I think is really is really fair. So for the time being, take it for what it is. The Jets have a nice pool. It's relatively short on names, perhaps, but what the Jets do have is nice, and I think Winnipeg has done well with what they've acquired. So all that said, fun pool, but where I sort of worry for the Jets this upcoming season is that a lot of these guys are relatively distant. A lot of these players need at least a couple of years of seasoning. And so the Jets roster this upcoming season for me has a very serious depth problem. It's one that's maybe gone a little bit under the radar just because everyone's sort of excited about the youth movement. But I want to talk specifically about this season because I think the depth issue is a question that's going to be a lot more apparent once you start to suffer some injuries. And inevitably, injuries do happen. You just don't have a fully healthy season. I want to chat about that in just a moment and what the Jets might need to do to sort of fortify that situation. But before we go any further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners from earlier at FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel over the past year or two. It's America's #1 sports book. It's safe, secure, easy to use, has tons of props, lines, odds, and all sorts of sports that they cover, whether you're looking for college football, the NHL, MLB, NBA, auto racing. They really have got everything you could imagine, and so many people already use FanDuel. Great service. Could not be easier to get started. But, we might have a little bit of a different offer for you, something that's maybe a bit more of interest as we head into this NFL season. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game, which if you're a Ravens fan not living in Baltimore, that's great for you. I don't know if anyone listens to this podcast and is a Ravens fan, but if you aren't, first off, you're smart. Second off, I love you. Third off, you could actually really benefit from this particular offer. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook to get started. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting about the Winnipeg Jets upcoming season, and sort of something that, for me, I don't really see a lot of people talking about. Not that it's like the world's biggest problem. There's obviously been some bigger headlines recently, not only for the hockey world at large, but for the Jets specifically. And so for the Jets, I think that there's probably been not a lot of thought about what happens if guys get injured on this team. There's definitely a real push going forward for a youth movement, which I think is awesome. That's what I've wanted. I think a lot of us have asked for it. Where there might be some level of concern for this season specifically is that the Jets are kind of in a transition point, which means a lot of those young players and stuff may not be ready for NHL duty. They might be here in the years afterwards, but this season, the Jets are kind of running on a little bit of a thin crew. You have to think about, injuries being a real potential problem. If Ehlers sticks around the season, he usually gets hurt for a good 15 to 20 games, unfortunately. We've had seasons where Scheifele has missed significant time, and the team really wasn't the same without him. I recall Nemesnikov having to play top 6 minutes on a routine basis because the Jets were running out of warm bodies, and so he had how to really elevate his game and, either sometimes play first line moments or mostly second line minutes. So all that to say, this season, the Jets aren't going to have a great luxury of big name replacements, right? If anyone in the top 6 gets injured, it's going to be a bit of a tough fit. I do think that you're going to see some of the younger players perhaps get a promotion here. Maybe, you find out if you have a little more in Morgan Barron. Maybe this is a chance to see if Brad Lambert could potentially anchor your top 6 in the future. But I think with any sort of injury, it sort of exacerbates the the lack of depth that the Jets currently have, which I don't think that it's something that I want them to sign loads of players for either, right? I wouldn't really be looking for them to just sign depth guys to fill the ranks. I don't think that that's a good use of money, and I don't think it would really benefit the Jets. For one thing, you don't really want to block your internal kids from getting a chance to have maybe a bigger role and a bigger look, but I do wonder if the Jets maybe try and make a trade for like a middle or a top 6 forward. I just feel like Winnipeg right now is lacking a little bit of punch. I think that the potential of the roster is greater than what their current output and likely output is this season, which isn't a bad thing. I think it's a realistic issue that the Jets are likely to face. I see a lot of people talking about this team as being better than it was last year, stronger on paper and stuff. And I actually disagree. I think it's easy to look at how bad the team was against the Avs in the playoffs and sort of overlook the fact that the Jets during the regular season were generally pretty strong, right? The second half wasn't really as good as the first, but overall, you lose Monahan and Toffoli, who are both regular season pretty good contributors. They may not have made a difference in the playoffs all that much, but in the regular season, they still played pretty well for the Jets. And Winnipeg is not going to be replacing them with equivalent veterans. We're going to be asking rookies to contribute similar points totals, and that is kind of a lot to expect from the kids. So I do kind of worry a little bit about this team's offensive potential this year. I think growth will be the biggest takeaway. There is a chance that I'm sort of worrying about this for nothing and that the youth really hit the ground running. They already perform at a high level, and they make it seem like we didn't really lose anyone. But I just think that that's not the most likely scenario. The league this year and in the previous few seasons has had a really high barrier of entry, and I think sometimes even I take it for granted. We're so used to seeing top young talents hit the league immediately and do super well, but that's actually not really happening as much over the past couple of seasons. Increasingly, it has been harder and harder for young talents to really break into the league and actually succeed and do well. And so that for me kind of signals that maybe the Jets should prepare for more turbulence this season. I think with Winnipeg needing, quite a few young players to step up on a roster where you're only icing 18 skaters per game, if you're having even 3 young players with limited NHL experience, that is quite a bit. And so I say all of this not to like poo-poo the team or to make you think that the Jets are going to be bad this year. But I do think that if Winnipeg has any sort of injury, that's going to have a considerable impact on this team's ability to be playoff competitive. I haven't really, worried too much about the playoffs because I think this team this year should really be focused on building good habits more than anything. And I know people will say, well, last year you said so-and-so about, the next 2 seasons needing to be the window. But I think things have changed with how, some of the trades have gone down, how the team has done some of the offseason work. I think Winnipeg has maybe adjusted its timeline for how it sees the present and future developing over the next year or two. And so this year, I think I'm not really expecting the team to be great. I'll be honest. I think this team is going to be fun to watch, but I think if you have even 1 or 2 injuries, it could have a pretty tremendous downstream impact. And I don't think the kids are going to be ready to step up and answer that call just yet. I think eventually they will. And I think that time may come sooner than later. But for the time being, I would think that this team is likely to have some significant turbulence, maybe a couple of big setbacks. And if one of Scheifele or anyone else goes down, there's probably a bit of a tough situation and one the Jets may not be able to recover from. But I guess all of that sort of leads into a bigger question with this team, and one that I'm still not sure of myself. But I guess a lot of us are wondering what this team actually is this year. Is it a contender? Is it a playoff appearance kind of team? What are we looking at? And I think it's a question I've tried to grapple with throughout this offseason. And at the end of the day, I suppose I'm still not sure. But as we kind of get closer and closer to preseason and the start of the season itself, I think it's worth at least talking about to try and figure out what are our odds for actually having a fun, productive year with like a real shot at not only a playoff appearance, but like a round or two of victories. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to say again, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. I highly encourage you to make your second listen the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts, same as Locked On Winnipeg Jets. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hey, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us as we are just trying to answer a question that's been bugging me over the past couple of months. One that I'm still not entirely sure I have a clear answer on, but I guess the biggest question is what is this Winnipeg Jets team this upcoming season? Is it a good team? What are we kind of looking at with the squad heading into a year in which originally it was supposed to be part of Winnipeg's competitive window, but I think things have significantly changed with not only the change in the coaching staff, but also this team's offseason where, we're now without McGroarty. We may be without Ehlers at some point if he does get traded. So a lot's been changing. The Jets have kind of, I would say, had a relatively good offseason given the circumstances. I think things could have gone really south very quickly for this team, but for the most part, the Jets have kept their heads straight. I think that they've made some relatively decent choices. They avoided any really, really bad deals. And so overall, I suppose I can't really complain. I do have some minor disappointments, I would say, but otherwise, again, it's minor, right? In the grand scheme of things, I'd still say this offseason has generally been pretty good. I think the important thing is that the Jets don't get tied up in really bad deals, that they don't disadvantage themselves before the season even starts. And I think so far they continue to have flexibility to do what they need to do. And if they make a smart choice with Perfetti's deal, and if they can get him locked up long-term, I think you're looking at, honestly, a bit of a really solid offseason, maybe even like an A-grade offseason, if you can find a way to get Perfetti to agree to something beyond 5 or 4 or 5 years. So some excitement there. But I guess, what is this team, right? I think the Jets are a retooler. That's the word I'm going to use for them. I think it makes the most sense. I think it fits where this team is developmentally speaking, not because the Jets are bad. I think if you're thinking about where they're going to finish in the standings, they'll be in the top 4 of the Central most likely. I do think that I'm not really anticipating them sliding too much into the top 3 necessarily, like on the high side. Dallas may have taken a step back considerably with their roster, but I don't feel that it's enough of a step back to where a Jets team that's lost considerable veteran experience is going to slide into their spot. So I think Colorado's still going to be relatively good, even though they do have their own depth issues. I think Dallas is going to be very good. Winnipeg could maybe have a really solid shot at being the 3rd best team. But the problem is now that the Preds have significantly escalated their timeline and have really improved the roster, and also now have like 3 first-round picks that they can use to go crazy at the trade deadline. Suddenly the Jets kind of, for me, find themselves maybe in the 4 or 5 slot, which, given how good the Central is, I don't know that that's necessarily like an insult. I just think it tells you that the team has lost some skill and some depth. Now they're going to have to rely more on kids. And if the kids really hit their stride and things do really well in the opening months, well, you can adjust that perception and maybe rank them more in like a playoff contender status. But I think right now retooling is the best way to describe them. I think the biggest focus of the season is developing good habits with the kids. I think the team's going to really work on, turning the squad into a team that next year is going to be more of a playoff ready squad, right? I think this year the team just doesn't have enough depth. I think the kids are going to have some early struggles. And so I don't feel like the team is ready to consider itself a contender, especially considering, many of the league's best contenders are a lot deeper. They have more skill, more offensive punch. The one thing the Jets can considerably count as an advantage is Hellebuyck, right? He is the great equalizer, but I don't think it's going to be enough to get them past some of these top teams. I mean, look what happened against Colorado, man. They basically undressed the Jets in 5 games, and so that was a tough, painful lesson, and one that I think the team has actually taken a lot from. You look at how they're drafting now, lots of speed, lots of industry, some skill here and there where they can find it. But I think you can see Winnipeg wanting to modernize and change as a result of what they saw against the Avs. So this year, I just, as much as I would love to call this team playoff ready and a playoff contender, I really don't feel that they are. I think that eventually they will get there, but I think this year really should be one for growth. All of the changes, all of the uncertainty, all of that to me, I just feel that they're going to be a fun team, and I think that they will have some opportunities to even be good. And I think the further they get in the season, assuming they stay healthy for the most part, I think that they could have a real shot at, maybe challenging for the number 3 seed in the Central, most likely fitting into a wild card spot. The trade deadline could be very interesting for them. Maybe Ehlers gets shipped off. I have no idea what happens with that. I was fairly certain that he was going to be gone, either at the start of the season or by the trade deadline. I'm wondering if things change by the moment, by the time we get to the deadline, because maybe Ehlers himself feels a little more comfortable re-signing with Arneal's usage of his abilities, but I don't know. I look at all of this and I just think that there's still some stuff that's not going to be resolved by the trade deadline. And it could be a challenging season for the Jets, trying to figure out what kind of team they want to be and how much they feel they're ready to push. My sense is I wouldn't rush things. See how the kids do. If they really hit it out of the park, then maybe you get more aggressive. But I think the most important thing is be smart, raise them up the right way, get them acclimated to the NHL level, and as they start to succeed or struggle, go from there. Make your decisions at that point, and kind of figure out if you want to, worst case scenario, if the kids are really struggling and the veterans aren't able to carry the load, and maybe some guys get hurt, maybe you kind of think about being a little bit of a seller for 1 year, and revisiting, next season, maybe a stronger roster, right? Adding some top end talent to the pool certainly would not be undue. And it could set you up for a faster cycle to get back to being a higher end competitor. I think this team is right now in a good spot for the future. A couple of things that they do need, long term, but at least for the season, I'm mostly worried about making sure this team is on the right direction, right? You don't have to be great. If you are, that's awesome, but focus on developing and setting good habits. So let me know what you're hoping for from this season. What do you think this team is? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here later this week with even more Jets coverage and hopefully a Cole Perfetti long-term contract announcement.